There are a lot of unsolved mysteries in Deltarune. The strange generator room in the outskirts of the town, the disappearance of Des, why there's even a dark world in the school supply closet in the first place. But the biggest overarching mystery, and the one which got the gears of the Deltarune narrative turning, is the Knight. We're only given vague clues about this mysterious figure in Chapter 1, with Sham and the King briefly mentioning them, and while there were many theories on who could be the Knight at that point, no one was really sure. But at the end of Chapter 2 we got a more solid candidate for who might be the Knight, as none other than Kris themselves opened a dark fountain in their living room, showing that they were the one creating new dark worlds and messing with the balance of light and dark all along. Except, it's not that simple. You see, not everyone agrees that Kris is the Knight, because there are some inconsistencies with the theory, and alternative options for who might hold that title. For example, at the end of Chapter 2, Queen just says that any Lightner is able to create a dark fountain. So Kris might have just learned about that fact right then and there, which is why they decided to open a new fountain at the end of the chapter. Some people also believe that there's more evidence to suggest that another character is the Knight, such as Gaster, Asriel, Ralsei, or the player themselves. And actually I also think that Gaster is a credible candidate for the Knight, which is why he will be the subject of my next theory, which I'm posting tomorrow. But today I'd like to focus on Kris, because while I agree that this hypothesis is far from perfect, I also think that there's plenty of good evidence to support it, and that the inconsistencies can be explained at least to some extent. While I don't claim to definitely prove that Kris is the Knight, I hope to at least make a case for it that's decent enough for people to at least consider this theory. So let's start with the evidence. Why do I believe that Kris might be the Knight? Well, as mentioned earlier, there is the fact that we outright see Kris open a new dark fountain at the end of the chapter, though there was an alternative explanation for that. But there's also some evidence to suggest that Kris was the one who opened the new dark fountain at the end of Chapter 1. Remember that scene at the end of the chapter where Kris jumps out of bed in the middle of the night and starts walking around all creepy? Notice how when they take a step, the sound it makes is the same sound from when we had just entered the dark world, and also we hear that same sound in the two scenes in Chapter 2 where Kris pulls out their soul. Queen also says that the Knight created their world on that very day, so someone had to have made the new dark fountain very early in the morning, before anyone else had entered the lab. Incidentally, that's also when we see Kris jump out of bed and pick up their knife. Alphys also says that Kris looks more tired than usual, which could be the result of them going all the way to the computer lab in the middle of the night. Remember that while the town may seem small to us, it's implied that to the characters it's a lot bigger. Toriel takes the car to go to the school that's seemingly only 200 meters away. And Undyne apparently doesn't know Alphys, despite the fact that we only see like 20 people in this city. So going to the lab and back might take longer from the character's perspective. And although the fact that Kris ate a whole pie during the night might be the explanation for why they're tired, they also could have just done both things. And to me it just seems more plausible for them to be extra tired after walking around town rather than just from eating a pie. Plus, considering that at the end of Chapter 2 we see Kris jump out of the bathroom window only to slash the tires of Toriel's car, we can definitely say that they are willing to do some vandalism. So even if the computer lab was closed at night, Kris would probably be willing to break into it. Another key piece of evidence is the fact that Kris is uniquely connected to the fountains, as Ralsei tells us right at the beginning of Chapter 1 that only they can close it. This is rather odd since any Lightner can open one, and we're never told that humans might have some specific connection to the fountains that monsters don't have. Something else that connects Kris to the Dark World is the fact that when we first go to save the game, their name appears on the save file, which could mean that they've already been there before. Kris is also the only one who can see the save light, and so far this light has only appeared in the Dark World. Now, it's worth mentioning that after we reset the game, their name no longer appears there, but the fact that it did so in the first place, and that Kris has some unique connection to these save points that only appear in the Dark World, is still pretty noteworthy. Another key piece of evidence is the fact that the Dreamer family crest is also the Deltarune, and the Angel's Heaven that Ralsei says we have to banish. The crest we see in the legend actually has two arrows pointing up and one pointing down, which is the same pattern that we see in Kris's bedroom, further suggesting that they, and possibly Asriel, have a specific connection to the Dark World. Finally, while I'll admit that it's more tangential evidence, I still think it's important to point this out. On Noelle's blog that was discovered during the Spamton sweepstakes event, in the newest girl page, she talks about one day when Susie was bullying Kris, only for the following exchange to happen between them. Kris's mouth looked like it moved. To be honest, moved so slightly I couldn't even tell if they said something or what, but whatever it was, Susie's attitude suddenly completely changed. She let go of Kris, backing off quickly, then left the room in such a hurry story, she easily would have won today's leaving first race. I really wish I could have seen her reaction, but I was so scared she would see me that I literally jumped into my locker. In the end, all I could see through the little slats was her shape from behind, going towards the entrance of the school with her head held low. In chapter 1, we hear about how the knight drove Jevil and the king to insanity simply by talking to them. If Kris was able to freak out Susie so much that she fled after a single sentence, I also think that they're a good candidate for the character who can drive others insane with her words. There are a lot of things pointing to a connection between Kris, the Dark World, and the fountains, all of which strongly suggest that they might be the knight, but not everyone is convinced. As I mentioned earlier, there are some arguments against this theory. For starters, if Kris is the knight, why do none of the Darkners recognize them? Not even their most devout followers like the king or the queen. There's also the fact that Kris hesitates when first entering the supply closet with Susie. If they created a dark fountain before and knew what the Dark World was, why did they hesitate? These are valid questions, but I also think that both of them have one simple answer. There are actually two Krises. The creepy soulless kid with red eyes, an affinity for knives, and who's apparently willing to endanger their own friends and family by creating new dark fountains is like Kara from Undertale, and the stoic protagonist that's being controlled by us is like Frisk. Many of the apparent inconsistencies in the theory are explained by the fact that the evil Kara-like Kris is a knight, while the normal or Frisk-like Kris is not. So allow me to focus on this theory for a moment. The parallels between Kris and the humans from Undertale are pretty obvious, and as soon as the game came out, everyone was quick to point them out. Even Kris's name and design are basically just a combination of Kara and Frisk. But besides their general appearance and behavior being similar to the two humans, there are other factors that support the two Krises theory, and also tie into the idea that they are the knight. We're given a seemingly contradictory message by the game, that Kris is apparently being controlled by us and isn't happy about it, with them even refusing to properly follow some of our instructions, like when they don't play the piano at the hospital, or when they open the door to Asriel's room in the Dark World with their eyes closed. Despite all of this, they're also seemingly able to take out the soul whenever they feel like it, and put it back on out of their own volition. And if anything, Kris is the one pulling the strings behind the scenes by opening a new dark fountain and dragging us along for the ride. So why are they upset when we are in control, and why does the game tell us several times during the first chapter that our choices don't matter? This can be explained by the two Krises theory, as we see clear parallels with Frisk's and Kara's behavior in Undertale. Kara is seemingly able to take control at any time, as they outright tell us that we were never in control at the end of Genocide, and also show themselves at the end of a soulless pacifist run. Even then, Kara mostly lets us do as we please, as they only chip in during a few fights and some of the narration during Genocide. Frisk on the other hand is almost never in control and had us and Kara attached to them without their consent. Frisk is only able to move on their own during some of the cutscenes, so the amount of control they have seems to be very limited, and can be taken away by Kara or the player at a moment's notice. Similar to them are Evil and normal Kris. The former is able to take out the soul and move around as they see fit, and that's exactly what they do when it's convenient for their own goals, but they still choose to let us do mostly what we want. Normal Kris, on the other hand, seems to be attached to the soul, which is currently being controlled by us, and they aren't very happy about that. This explains the initial message the game gave us about how our choices don't matter. They clearly do, as evidenced by the Snowgrave route, but that message wasn't directed at us, but rather at normal Kris, who's upset that they're being controlled by the player and being dragged around to new adventures by the soulless Kris. Much like Frisk, although they seem to have a little control in a few specific occasions, it's still very minimal. The two Krises theory also explains why they're hesitant when first entering the supply closet. At the end of both chapters, we see evil Kris tear out the soul before creating a fountain, so while it's not really clear if the knight created the fountain in the supply closet, if Kris is the knight and did create it, they probably left the soul in the birdcage before doing so, in which case normal Kris, who's attached to the soul, wouldn't have seen it and so wouldn't know what was going on in the supply closet, hence why they hesitated. The game itself implies that evil Kris has used the birdcage to store the soul before, not only because it's in the corner of their bedroom with the door open, but the narration also says that it's seen quite a few crashes. This theory also explains why the Darkners don't recognize Kris. For starters, since the appearance of the Lightners changes when they enter the Dark World, evil Kris's appearance could just be different. But there's also the possibility that what's happening is something similar to what we see in Undertale's Genocide route. During this route, although nothing about our appearance changes, the monsters don't recognize us as human anymore, with Asgore even asking us if we're some kind of monster. When normal Kris is in control, or rather we are in control of them now, the Darkners perceive Kris as a normal Lightner, but when soulless Kris is in control, the Darkners see them as someone entirely different. Okay, that's enough of the two-Kris's theory, but it's important to show how it connects to the Knight theory and to their character in general. And not only do I think that there's plenty of evidence for the idea that Kris is actually two people, but this also ties neatly into and gives more credibility to the Knight theory by plugging some of its apparent holes in a way that I think it's pretty straightforward. Nonetheless, there is another argument against the theory that I think is worth addressing. After we enter the cyber world, Ralsei appears to say that he felt a dark presence before hurrying over. If Kris really opened the fountain during the middle of the night, why did Ralsei not fill it beforehand? There's also the closet in the computer lab that the narration specifically points out as being large enough for a person to fit inside. So could all of this mean that there was someone there who opened the fountain after Noelle and Berdly entered the computer lab? Maybe. I'll admit that this whole opening sequence is strange, but it's not really just a problem for the Kris is the Knight theory, but rather it's kind of a plot hole in general that's hard to make sense of. Let me explain. For starters, I just want to point out that the line about a large person fitting inside the closet could be in reference to the giant robot that Queen uses, and the closet, with its several shelves of old electronics, is probably the castle, but that's just an educated guess. But if we assume that the Knight was actually hiding there before opening the fountain, this brings its own set of problems and inconsistencies. We've already seen how opening a fountain is by no means something subtle. So if someone did hide in the closet and opened a dark fountain when Berdly and Noelle were already there, did those two really not notice anything while someone was opening a fountain right next to them? And did they not think of leaving the room before the darkness took over? What I think makes more sense is if, like with Kris and Susie first entering the supply closet, the dark world in the computer lab didn't properly activate until they actually entered the room. There's also the problem of timing. A lot of stuff changed really fast after the Knight created the fountain, with Spanton going insane and living in the dump, Queen also kind of losing her mind, changing the whole cyber world and enslaving a bunch of characters. And after Berdly and Noelle showed up, she also took the time to capture them, and looking at the destroyed environment when we entered the cyber world, apparently there was quite the fight. So did all of this happen in the time Kris and Susie were in the castle town? How long were they even there? An hour? 2 hours? Maybe you can fit all of the aforementioned events in the span of a few hours, but the cyber world changing overnight just seems like far less of a stretch to me. Putting that aside, there's still the problem of Ralsei. When exactly did he fill this fountain? If the new fountain was created while Kris and Susie were still in the castle town and Ralsei felt it then, this means that they said nothing for some reason, which is very weird. But if the fountain was only created after they left the castle town, at which point Ralsei felt it and rushed over, this either means that at most, there's only a handful of minutes between the Knight creating the fountain and our protagonists arriving there. Or the new fountain was created before then, but Ralsei couldn't detect it at that point for some reason. And how did Ralsei even get to the cyber world anyways? We know that Lancer and Rules are objects that we had to bring here through the real world, but Ralsei just appears out of nowhere? And why does he not become stone like Lancer and Rules? And why do none of the other Darkners become stone under his fountain? And this is all assuming that Ralsei is even telling the truth despite all the mystery surrounding his character. All I can say is that this goat is one sussy-wussy fluffy boy, and this opening makes no sense. I'm rambling, but I think you get the point. It's not just a matter of the scene not quite fitting with the Kris is the Knight theory. The whole opening just doesn't make much sense from a theorizing perspective, and I'm not 100% sure of what to make of all of this. But like I said, I still think that there's plenty of evidence to make Kris a credible candidate for the Knight, even if the theory isn't perfect. But if you are unconvinced and think that this theory is wrong, fret not, for I have another candidate for who might be the Knight, Gaster. There are a ton of things connecting Gaster to the Deltarune universe, and tomorrow I'm posting a video exploring all of these points. So if that sounds interesting, subscribe and enable notifications to make sure you won't miss it.